As the days passed and I took notice of the great line of huge trucks on Wellington Street. The invasion, it was nothing less, of the huge 18-wheelers and their drivers, the nightly bonfires, the fearful lineups at the few takeouts still open. I knew matters had reached a head. This was an absolute crisis. I immediately called an emergency cabinet meeting. The peril was great. The thought ran through my mind that it might be on my watch that the great experiment, the over 150 years of our precious Confederation, could be at an end. It was a thought too much to bear. So much was yet to be done. It could not all end now. There were carbon taxes yet to raise, net zero legislation yet to pass, IPCC meetings yet to attend. What to do? We had never faced a situation like this before. A whole crowd of Westerners holding barbecues and bringing something called a bouncy castle into our glorious capital. Some nights, as worried citizens looked on, there were even sing-alongs. Insurrection is never far away when radicals break out their guitars. Insurrection is never far away when radicals break out their guitars. Prior to the meeting I called various world leaders, the US President, the Prime Minister of Britain and many others. The Prime Minister of India was busy, to both ask for advice and to set up contingency support should my government be forced to flee the capital and take up residence in exile. Barbados would have been nice. I thought of calling Brian Mulroney, but, even in extremity, there are extremes to which one should not go. Fearing a backbench revolt, I left him undialed. Minister Guilbeault volunteered to shimmy up the Peace Tower to do some reconnaissance. But we determined that ground sources were all that were needed. News kept flowing in before the cabinet met. There was a report of a chilling arson attempt at a downtown apartment building, with the vandals actually forcing the lobby doors closed and sealing them with tape to prevent residents from fleeing once the inferno had begun. Fortunately, they were unable to get the fire going. But the incident underscored just what kind of mentality the country was facing. Okay, so I was wrong to think this was connected to the convoy. Hindsight is 20/20. I was also greatly disturbed, extremely so, by a report that came to me from our national broadcaster, the CBC, that it was possible the Russians were behind all this. And if not the Russians and climate-denying Putin, who else? North Korea? The Maldives? But the ultimate precipitating activity, the action that shook my government and all Ottawa observers to their core was the honking. Years later people still tremble in recalled trepidation over the honking. The night of the Long Honks, as history has recorded this episode. Never in the whole history of insurrections and attempted overthrows of government has there been such percussive horror. Even the most hardened revolutionaries, Fidel, for example, stop short, draw the line somewhere. They may swarm the capital, but they do not hit the truck horns. It was a time of the gravest tension. Thus it was that the cabinet met under a dark halo of deepest worry and anxiety. I canvassed the table. To a man and a woman we were one. Act we must, both fast and furious. Unfortunately, the War Measures Act, with its teeth of steel and magnificent powers of arrest, which my father had deployed in a similar but less threatening occasion, was not at my disposal. All I had to fall back on was the tamer Emergencies Act. It was a time of the gravest tension. One of the cabinet ministers made the interesting suggestion that since this was, as he saw it, and in fact as we in the cabinet all saw it, a national emergency, not just some municipal crisis, we should engage the premiers. He reminded us that as Canada was a confederation, and it was after all Confederation itself that we were preparing to save, that perhaps they, the premiers, should be, if not involved, then at least let in on the peril, and advised that we were about to call upon powers unused before, and to an extent unprecedented. I will confess I gave it some thought, and I did agree that in some ways it was true that it was their Canada, too. Yet I hesitated to involve them. And I remembered the great maxim, I think it was Napoleon's, that too many cooks spoil the broth. Besides, the premiers had their own problems. In the end, as all now know, it was unanimous. We called up the Emergencies Act, called in the banks to freeze some accounts, threatened seizure of assets, and naturally arrested the core leaders. One Tamara Lich was charged with mischief and denied immediate bail. Naturally, though he was not at the cabinet meeting, Jagmeet Singh was on side. When we told him of our decision, he was beside himself. So ended the most dramatic moment in post-Confederation history. We cleared Wellington Street of parked 18-wheelers. Saved the mask mandates for many more months, and most precious of all, showed once and for all that if radicals come into Ottawa and press on their horns, the Government of Canada is ready to act. P.S. Some latter-day revisionists have questioned whether in fact this was really a national crisis. Was it not, actually, a municipal one, just not to a crisis? And was that the reason the premiers were not involved in the consultations for a decision of such momentous import? All I have to say to them, they were not here when the horns were blaring. And when Ottawa is upset, everyone is upset.